Hey there, this is Susie, and we are for a second live Facebook video, and I want to chat a little bit about SI joint issues and the things that I've seen clinically that I think will help you. Now I'm going to go through one primary thing that you can consider, and that is this. When I work with people with SI joint issues, what I consistently see over and over and over again as a pattern is they have really poor hip mechanics. Now, this might not be a total surprise, but what I also find is that people also feel like their hamstrings are really, really tight. And not all the time, but there can be a tendency toward that. So they tend to come in and they say, you know, my hamstrings are super tight, and also that they have weak core. And if they could just release through their hamstrings, if they could just strengthen their core, that all will be fine. What I then see as we take a look and assess is, well, their mechanics of their hips are really funky. So when they think they're moving into a hamstring stretch, for example, they actually aren't doing a hamstring stretch at all. Like they might be pulling their leg really, really far in order to have a stretch sensation per se, but they're not actually doing any real work to support the hamstring because they're compensating like crazy, right? So they think they're moving adequately through the leg bone and the hip socket, but in fact they aren't. And what becomes really interesting is helping a client become aware of what their mechanics actually are. So if we take a look at this hip joint, for example, we'll see that this is a ball and socket joint, right? And we've got the hip bone through here. And this leg bone can move in 6 different directions. It can move forward, and it can move back, and it can move into rotation. It can move abduction and adduction, right? Those are those 6 ranges of motion. And a lot of time people perceive that they're doing those ranges, but in fact, they're doing all sorts of other things. And in yoga, for example, when we're working with someone who's a yoga practitioner, what's really common is, for example, if someone comes into tree, they might think that they're going into rotation of their leg bone and their hip socket, when in fact what they're doing is they're moving their whole pelvis, right? And so then they do this. They move their pelvis and they look down and they say, oh crap, I've moved my pelvis. I better come back again. But the thing is that they thought they were moving their leg bone to get into that position, but they moved their pelvis. And so the perception or the proprioception that they had of how they moved was slightly off. So they often can think that they're moving that leg bone in the hip socket, but they actually aren't. So one of the big things that I initially walk people through is how their leg bones are actually moving in their pelvis. Now, some people will say to me, well, Susie, that's pretty simple. Yeah, it is. And it's really overlooked, right? So you'll often see people in the gym, or you'll often see people at yoga consistently moving outside of what really is the range of motion for their hip. And it's just because that they're not aware, right? And so something that I want you to consider is this, right? Where the pain is not the problem. So people are experiencing perhaps issues in and around this area, right? So the SI joints are where the sacrum meets these ilium here. And so they might be experiencing pain somewhere in this area, and someone might have diagnosed them with like, yes, you have an SI joint issue. But the question for me then becomes, well, why? Right? Because the SI didn't wake up one day and say, I am going to give Paulina, who I can see that you're on this right now, I'm going to give Paulina a really hard time today. Although it can certainly feel that way sometimes, can't it? But really, it's like people, like SI doesn't wake up one day and say, I'm just going to be this way. What's really important to understand is that the SI is behaving the way it's behaving because it is responding to the forces at play. So there's other things that are happening that are causing this to be the area that's being expressed, right? So the next piece of this is where the pain is not the problem, but where the problem is tends to be under our level of awareness, which is why you can go after and after and after the fixes to support you with your SI joint, but it doesn't actually resolve because you're not actually solving the problem that is. You're actually solving the problem that isn't. And so you get some symptom relief and you circle around and you feel better, and then you come back and you have symptom relief, but you don't actually make like actual resolving change. And so if you're looking to have actual resolving change and not just symptom relief, then that's when you can actually begin to look at, well, what are you not aware of? And the way to become aware of something is to have someone look at you who understands movement, right? And to see what are the things that you aren't perceiving in your own body, and so that you can then perceive them, right? Like I think about someone that I go and see when I'm kind of stuck, and she points stuff out to me. And I'm like, no, you've got to be kidding. How can I not be aware of that? But the truth is that I'm doing something right now that even though I can see myself on the screen, I'm doing something right now that I can't perceive, but you can see, right? Because our eyes only look outward, right? And so we can only perceive what we can perceive. And yeah, it's interesting, Ellie, right? You were thinking about this the other day. Are you thinking like you were thinking about what the pain is and where the problem is, or quick fix, or what part of it was it that you weren't that you were thinking about? And as you type that out, I'll keep going. So one of the things that I really like to play around with people is that how these leg bones move in the hip sockets is so incredibly vital, because one thing I've seen as a fundamental piece is that when someone is overutilizing their hip flexors, for example, in movements that aren't required for the hip flexors, when we can resolve that pattern, SI joint pain goes away. So does back pain and all sorts of other stuff. But because this particular live is about SI joint pain, that's where I'm going to focus. And so when we actually get the hip flexors moving the way they're meant to move, when we get the abductors and the adductors and the rotators and the extensors moving the way they're actually supposed to move, then the way the forces get absorbed and dissipated, how they move from the upper body to the lower body and back from the lower body up to the upper body, how that all happens really begins to shift the way your tissue absorbs. And then the issues that lie here tend to go away because we're just moving our body properly, right? So when this leg bone actually moves the way it's actually designed to move in the hip socket, then we don't have to compensate elsewhere. And if you've been following me for any length of time, you know that I speak a lot about reducing compensatory patterning. Because you think about it, if your leg bones are not moving as they should, and this is a huge joint, right? It has some of the most biggest ranges of motion in the body. And if it's not moving the way it's supposed to move, if there's congestion present in through this area and it's not moving the way it's supposed to move, then something's got to take over for it, right? Something's got to kick in to do its job. And so something's got to give, right? Like, so sometimes we use the QL, sometimes we use the opposite hip, sometimes we use our rib cage, sometimes we use our neck. And then the thing, because our neck or our rib cage or our QL or other parts of the body are not actually the thing that's moving if that's not what they're designed to do, then fatigue sets in, and guess what? We find another way of compensating. So we layer these compensating strategies on top of each other, and we become this stacked state. And then we wonder why our body begins to feel like it's breaking down over a period of time, right? It's because the area, and what I see, it's because the area that's actually meant to be doing the movement, which is around the leg bones, around the hip socket, for example, is not doing the movement. And so when I can teach a client how to actually move this leg bone properly, then a whole host of stuff begins to change. So if it's a yoga practitioner that I'm working with, tree pose is a great place to start. And so are you actually moving the leg bone in the hip socket when you raise it up and when you rotate it? Or are you moving your pelvis? Even just a little bit, because even if it's just a little bit, that's still a compensatory pattern. You're still not doing something that you think you're doing. Now, to emphasize why this is so important is because you are actually sending signals back to your nervous system telling it that this is a normal way of moving. And so if that's the communication that is going on from this motor control and motor coordination perspective between your muscular system, your fascial system, your nervous system, if that's what normal is, then that's what normal will be. But it's not normal, right? Like, it becomes your normal, but it's actually not normal, right? So we want you to be able to move as well as you can in the movement you're doing. Right, the same thing goes with things like when you're prepping for warrior 2 or triangle, right? And you're taking your legs wide, and then people start to take the legs into rotation. But instead of doing that, then maybe I'll do it this way so you can see more clearly. So they take their legs wide, but instead of taking their legs wide and then rotating them and just making it a leg bone and pelvis motion, they then take their pelvis into an anterior tilt. Well, then what do we say as yoga teachers? Like, oh, well, that's not supposed to happen, so we're going to tuck the tailbone. But see, here's the thing. The thing is that by doing that, you just compensated on top of a compensation. So you probably stepped too wide. You tried to do the rotation, but you didn't have the available range. So then you anteriorly tilted your pelvis, and then you went, oh shit, I shouldn't do that. So I better tuck the tailbone back to neutral. But like I said, you just compensate on top of compensation, and then you start to become tighter and tighter and more congested in that particular area. So the first thing for you to really explore, and this is what I love to do with clientele, is to do some really simple movement of let's just see what your leg bone does. And I did this at a yoga conference in Toronto a few years ago. And I'll tell you what people said when they actually did this, because a lot of people could not do this. And so I'm going to just step to the computer in a sec, and I'm going to pull this screen down so I can be on the floor. So just hang on tight for a sec. All right, so here I come. All right, so I'm here, and so I should be on my back, but if I'm on my back, I can't see the screen. So I'm going to come up like this, okay? But I should be. We want you to be on your back. Actually, I can kind of see you here. And take your leg up, rotate your leg bone, and then bring the ankle onto your knee, right? And so what happened when I was at the yoga conference is people were doing that, but then see how the pelvis moved when I did that, right? So people thought that they were doing that movement well, right? They thought the movement was happening, leg bone in the pelvis, but what was actually happening is this, right? And so I'm going to show you here. The pelvis was moving. So look, there's no movement happening here. There's no movement of the leg bone in the hip socket here. The movement is all my pelvis relative to my rib cage. So if you aren't actually moving your leg bone in the pelvis, then what are you doing? Right? You see, it's simple, but super subtle, but more importantly, super powerful. Because what people said at the Toronto conference, you know what they said to me? They said, well, I just can't be bothered to do that. I can't be bothered to move that way because I feel like I'm going too slow. And I kind of scratched my head and I went, wow, okay, all right. Like, I get it. I totally get it. But you have SI joint pain. Like, you could actually have this different. If you simply, truly move better, you could have a different outcome. So it really becomes an interesting exploration, because if you can play around with this movement of actually moving your leg bone in the hip socket and truly making it that, you are like hours and maybe even like days away from not having SI joint pain. Because when you start to move better, then the forces in your body, how they're absorbed and dissipated, they start to change. It literally can happen that way. Now, here's the thing, is that once you start the new pattern, then you just got to grow the stamina around that new pattern, right? So you become aware. So you might start to become aware that your leg bones don't move as well in your hip socket. So you demonstrate what I just did. Like you say you do what I do, and you saw that pelvis move on yourself. And then you start to just do that movement very slowly, and you might actually realize, man, I don't have a lot of movement here. Well, yeah, then you do this. Woohoo! You do that because the greatest thing about moving better and noticing that you don't move well, the greatest thing about noticing you don't move well is that you can learn to move better, right? Like, it's that simple. Like, you can realize you don't move well, and then knowing that tissue can change, you can actually move better. And so if you just play with it and just play within the range that you actually have, you will get better, and you'll grow your stamina, because now the joint's moving a whole lot better than it had been, and then you're going to transfer load better, your tissue's going to absorb the load better, and you're going to feel a whole lot better, and your SI is going to feel better. Polina, you had said, yes, your leg bone mobility changed your body in ways that you didn't even know were possible. It's well worth the effort. Yeah, it totally is. If you're willing to, to take that step of really taking on your own level of awareness and then applying the awareness that you have and then seeing what happens and then just keep practicing that and getting clear on how things are working and how things aren't working and then making those changes as you go. So a key piece to this here again is this. The first one is where the pain is not the problem. That's number one. When you have SI joint issues, typically that SI joint issue is an expression of another biomechanical pattern that's at play. And the SI issue is just a response to the way things are moving or not moving in your structure. So if you can work with somebody who can help you see what you aren't aware of, if you can work with someone who can be that eye for you so you can then start to perceive what's actually going on in your body, then you will be able to actually solve the problem that is and not just keep bantering around the problem that isn't. Okay, that's super, super, super key. And what I just showed you was one exercise that you could play with around bringing the ankle to the knee. And does your leg bone move in your pelvis or not? And when you realize that, it's a place that you can explore. You can also take this legs up the wall, take the leg across your body, explore that movement, and then go from there. If you would like me to be the person who looks at your movement, by all means, send me a direct message. I'm happy to help. I'm happy to share what I see with you so that you can improve your SI joint issues, that you can improve your own movement and feel a whole lot better in your body. Alrighty? Thank you. This was a lot of fun. This was number 2 of Facebook Live. Get ready. I'll be on here again. Take care. Bye-bye.